Okay, so this session is now being recorded, and now I get to say once again, good morning to everyone. Welcome back. It's lovely to have you back again. Today, we're going to be looking at fact checking and research and how this can help you to not only improve your stories, actually, the stories that you want to submit to the media, but also hopefully how it can improve the content that you share and distribute from your organization or in your professional capacity. And I was going to ask everyone to sort of check in with how they're doing, but maybe I can say check in with us on the chat on the side. How has your week been? Christine sent a message saying that she hasn't been well since last week, so I hope you recover soon. I have definitely also had a little bit of autumn flu, so my throat's a little bit croaky, so excuse me, I'm sipping on some rooibos tea while the session continues. How's everyone else feeling? You're welcome to tell us how you're feeling or send a little note on the side. But I hope it has been a good week, and I hope that everybody also is looking forward to the Easter break ahead, which I think will be in place in most of our countries. If anyone has any questions about the exercise, you're welcome to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to get started talking about fact-checking and research, if that's good for everyone. Any questions? Anyone else aside from Christine want to tell us how they are? All right, everyone's feeling quiet this morning. I hope that doesn't mean that's because you're all sick. I hope that that's because you are engrossed by the content. Okay, let's try and get I'm trying to share my PowerPoint, but Zoom is being a bit funny. Hold on a moment. All right, there we go. Okay, so I hope you can all see my screen now. Oh, good. I have some messages in the chat. Okay, Sharon is doing well and had a good week. Yay. Rahim is also okay. And Atiela is also doing okay. Thank you for replying. I appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to get started now on today's session, which is all about how to use fact checking and research to make your story stronger, but also how to make your content for your organization quite a lot stronger. And just as a little bit of background to this, if you were in the session last week, you'll know I've worked as a journalist for nearly 30 years, based in South Africa, but working in stories and training around the African continent and in stories in other parts of the world. For several years while I was working as a journalist and before I finished my PhD, I worked with a fact-checking organization called Africa Check. And what I learned during this time was I think I'd probably been a bit arrogant about my skills as a journalist before I joined Africa Check in around 2013. And working with a fact-checking organization that used a lot of journalistic skills, but focused them in a slightly different way, taught me that it really transformed my journalism. It changed my process tremendously. It added such huge value to my journalism, to my academic work, and to all of my other professional work around communication, strategic consulting. I do a lot of research for governments as well. And these fact-checking processes that I learned and that I also taught and developed at the time have really, I think, improved after, nearly 30 years of being in the business. I think I'd been a journalist for about 10 or 15 years at the time. It has improved my work so much that I think these are skills that we can use elsewhere. And I particularly think that when it comes to issues around gender and women, we often don't lean in strongly enough. And I'm not mad about that phrase, leaning in. I'm not talking about the Sheryl Sandberg version, but we don't actually lean in often enough into the data. And there are a number of reasons for this. One, and I'm going to mention this later on as we talk through this morning session, women are underrepresented in data. So there's something called a gender data gap, where in so many countries, we simply don't have information about women. Maybe we know how many women there are, but we don't really know what these women do. We don't know much about women's health. There are many countries, if you look at sort of the United Nations, There are many, many countries that just report very, very little about women. And because we have so much missing information, particularly around women and violence and women and access to healthcare, women and access to education, women and access to human rights, women and access to economic, systems, because we just don't have this information, we often don't know what's happening. So part of the challenge for us working in these broad areas is, how do I tell a story that is backed up by information or data where the data doesn't exist? The other thing that I learned from my years of working with Africa Check was I often, unfortunately, came across really well-meaning NGOs, CBOs, sometimes even government organizations that, in order to make a point about the area of activism that they were involved in, sometimes ignored the data or misused data to make their presentation seem more dramatic. And ultimately, from what I could see from the ways that this was used and the ways that audiences responded to this is, yes, a very dramatic headline might draw people's interest in initially, but using dramatic headlines that are not backed up by data often has the long-term effect of undermining the very important work that many people are trying to do. So if we make false claims about women or about children, this is often used by governments, by conservative lobbies, by people who don't believe women. We can talk about some examples of that in a little bit. They're used to undermine the calls to action that we put out. So I think that using fact-checking can really transform your practice. It can add a huge amount of value to the stories that you want to tell. It makes your information seem more credible, more reliable. It makes your processes and your methods more transparent, which again adds to your credibility. It means that other people can independently verify the claims that you're making. And it's not just about you saying, oh, this is the way the world works. It makes data more accessible. And eventually, working in this way allows us to fill in these data gaps that exist. So today I'm going to take you through some basic principles, concepts, and ideas, and we're actually going to apply them to real life examples in your own countries, in your own communities. So I want to just start off by reminding everyone how important data is. And data is just information, okay? There's lots of ways of thinking about data. It could be information in numbers, it could be visual information, it could be, photographs, it could be sound. Data isn't just something that exists on a computer, although we often use computers to access that. But data really can change the way that we see the world. I'm going to give you an example of how radical different visions can, or different types of data can influence how we see the world. But what I also find useful is a lot of people are afraid of data because, particularly if you work in an activism space, because data is often used to marginalize women. It's often used to marginalize smaller organizations or communities because you don't reflect strongly in data. Or data is often used to control outcomes by states that you don't feel that they really care about people, they just care about numbers. And I think that for many of you in the session, based on the short introductions that we had last week, is the majority of you don't think of the communities that you work with as numbers. You think of them as people and as individuals. You think of them as communities. So I'm not suggesting that we reduce very, very real human phenomena to numbers. But it's also important that we are not afraid of using information and exploiting it. If we gather and we collect credible information, we can build stronger stories. Information also functions as like coordinates on a map. It tells us where we are. It tells us where we're going or where we want to go. So if you think about where I started talking this morning, sorry, before we started the recording, but about your organization's strategic objectives, the objectives of your work. So information and data can help us to plot where we need to get to. Maybe there's information that we need to gather, or there's a point that we need to reach, and we need to find information that will support us. Information allows us to check if we're in the right place or if we're looking in the right place. Sometimes, and this happens more often than you think, we're looking in the wrong place for the right information. very different types of data can be used differently to tell different stories. So depending on whether we use official data, academic data, community data, or anecdotal information, those can be used in different ways to tell different stories. And we need to remind ourselves to diversify the sources that we use. So in this session today, I'm going to show you how important it is to use official information, including statistics, but also how much context matters. So we always need to make sure that those statistics aren't just reducing a phenomenon to numbers, and that we're able to understand it in a broader way. And as I've put here at the bottom, facts matter a lot, because people will always remember when you're wrong, and they won't remember when you're right. But facts don't matter on their own. Context matters a lot. So I'm hoping that some of you have got a bigger screen and you can see the next slide that I want to show you. So I want to show you how information can change the way we see the world. So I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with this map. This is a visual representation of Earth. And we can see all the continents there all very nicely. We can see there's Africa, there's Europe, Greenland, which America is trying to steal. There's Norway, Latin America, North America. So we're very familiar with this. This is called a Mercator projection, and it's based on the person who drew it was Mercator, and it's based on a projection that allowed us to fit the world map of the continents into sort of a manageable size, like the size of almost a piece of paper turned on its side, so a landscape format. And in order to do this neatly, it sort of squashed the continents in a certain way, because the thing is that although this might be accurate-ish in terms of shapes, this is not accurate in terms of the actual size of each of the continents. So I want to show you what the world... Now, remember, we exist as a globe, so making us flat is quite hard. So again, it's an artistic and creative challenge, but also it's about data. So this is the classic Mercator projection that most of us will have. You know, we would have had it up in a classroom or seen it up somewhere. Governments will use it. This is a Peters projection. This more accurately shows the land mass of each of the continents. So I want you to see how big Africa is in the Peters projection compared to Europe, England, even North America, and Latin America is slightly more similar in size. But if we just go back a second, if you look at the Mercator projection, which is the classic one that we're all taught, it kind of looks like Africa and Europe are not that dissimilar in size. Europe's kind of pretty important. We look at the Peters projection, we actually see what Africa's importance and size is in the world. Is that we're pretty huge, and we're never represented like that. We're always represented as being slightly smaller than we are. And in a sense, that's what this Mercator projection didn't just compress the geographic data about the shapes of countries and the shapes of continents. It also resized things so that Greenland looked huge, Europe looked a little bit more impressive than it actually was. And again, when we go back to the Peters projection, we see that the sizes and shapes of these things, what we've been told is the state of the world, is a little bit different. So the types of data that we use can really change how we see the world. Can you imagine if this, the second one, the Peters projection, was the map that we had in every single classroom? It might change the way people think of Africa. And I mention this because later on in today's session, I'm also going to talk about what kind of data we have in African countries, and how this can sometimes be problematic, because we don't like to trust data that comes from Africa. We tend to be a lot more interested in data that comes from Europe or North America or other places. We have, even as Africans, an inherent distrust of ourselves. Anyway, so this is just how data can literally change how you see the world. And we should remember as African citizens that actually we're pretty big. And we're important players, and we shouldn't dismiss ourselves as easily as we often do. Now I want to kind of start to think about why facts matter to your message. And again, we started off this morning talking about matching story ideas to your organization. So here, I want to remind you that research and fact-checking isn't only here to help you develop better stories. It's also going to help make your content, as I said earlier, more credible, more transparent, and more accountable. And we should always, I think here, we should hold ourselves to the same standards that we would hold others to. So what are the kinds of standards for information that you would expect from your government or your politicians when they make a speech? And I'm going to give you some examples of these speeches a little bit later. But if we would expect a politician to be transparent, credible, and accountable, as individuals in our professions and as organizations, we should actually hold ourselves to at least the same standards, possibly higher. So research and fact-checking is really important. Even if we feel very strongly and very passionately about our work. In fact, when you feel very passionately about something, that's a very, very big red flag. And it's a reminder that you should be fact-checking your work more often, because the more strongly we believe in something, the less likely we are to check it. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But so research and fact-checking will make your stories better, and it'll make your content more credible, and it'll make you more accountable as an organization or as an individual. As I sort of alluded to in an earlier slide, fact-checking and research is also a really useful tool to help you identify where you don't have the answers. So one common mistake that I see amongst many organizations is sometimes we're missing information. And I said we have this gender data gap. Women in particular are not well represented in the data. But sometimes, because we have a data gap, we make up information to fill that gap because we think we know what's going on in there. And that's not always the right approach. Sometimes what we need to be saying is, I don't know, or in fact, we don't know, or we don't have enough information to tell. And what that points us towards is we need more studies, we need more research, we need more information. And hopefully one of the outcomes of today's workshop is there are places where perhaps you or your organization could help to build that information, to build that research through asking the right questions. So that's also an important feature here. It's important when we think about fact-checking and research. It's not something that's arbitrary, and it's not something that you sort of do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you just do what you feel like on the day. It's a system, and it's a process that you can apply to any story or any issue. And what's important here is that you apply the same systems and same techniques every single time if you want to make progress and if you want to identify the challenges that come up in your work. And I just mentioned here, when we go into the fact-checking exercise a little bit later, you can do fact-checking and research using your mobile phone or a computer. So mobile phones, if you have a smartphone, there's quite a lot of information that you can find there. It is easier on a computer, but it's absolutely possible on your phone. So you don't need any fancy equipment. All of the things that I'm going to suggest to you today are free. They're free to access, and you can access on a mobile. What the kinds of fact-checking and research that I teach, essentially they use journalistic techniques, or if you were looking in research, you might call it OSINT, so open source information, open source intelligence, but you're basically using journalistic techniques to research and to check your information and your sources. And another point here that we don't do often enough is you should always share your sources in your work. Journalists don't always do this unless they're quoting from a study. Academics have to do this. You have to share your sources. But I think as organizations, sometimes we forget to share the sources of our data. Politicians do this too. And again, we should hold ourselves to a higher standard than most politicians. Something else that's important is the idea of facts versus opinions. So if we're going to be thinking about fact checking, we need to think, what can we check? And what can we not check? So a fact is something that can be checked. It's backed up with credible evidence. An opinion is something that's based on a belief or a particular point of view. And what's really useful to know is that you can't fact check an opinion. So I think a lot of us who are on social media spend probably more time than we should trying to fact check people's opinions. So people may have different beliefs to you, and they may use facts to support different opinions, or they may claim to use facts to support different opinions. It's very, very hard to challenge or to fact check someone's opinion. So maybe just keep that in mind while we work through this. There's something else that you can't fact check, which is the future, and that'll become important in a moment. Something else that we have to remember, though, is that even if facts are something that can be checked, none of the ways in which we use information function in isolation. They're usually parts of very complex belief systems, cultural contexts, and when I used to work in fact checking and we would correct people, it also became very clear that simply correcting one fact or correcting one error often doesn't impact or change the person's belief about things. And that can be a challenge, because how do you address kind of systematic or systemic issues, misconceptions? And I'm going to ask you about some of those in a moment. And I just wanted to add here that research on the effectiveness of corrections through fact-checking is very mixed. So I'm a big fan of the fact-checking organizations that exist now. There's many across Africa. There's a few in Kenya. I'm not aware of any working in Uganda, but it's been a while since I've checked. And Africa Check does check for different countries as well. But we don't have very strong evidence that telling people they're wrong works. So one of the important outcomes from today's session is also, it's much more important to ensure that accurate information is shared at the start, rather than trying to fix or correct inaccurate information months or years later. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. And I'd like to ask you, I'm just checking, I've got some more. Christine has asked, what's the way to reference a source of data when writing an op-ed or newspaper article? Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to write that, hold on, I'm going to write that down, and we'll get to that when we, how to reference a source in an article. If anyone else has any questions, you're welcome to pop them in the chat on the side, or please write them down so that you don't forget what the questions are, and we will get to them later. So what I wanted to ask was, if you can already start thinking about this in your own experience, and this could relate to your work or to just something that you've experienced personally or in your country, is I just mentioned now the difference between facts and opinions, and about how people have very complex belief systems. So can anyone think of any widely held beliefs in your society or in your community that you think are wrong, but that are really hard to challenge? So I'll give you an example, is that globally, we know that it's common, it's often published that women often make false accusations of rape. Now, there's no data to support this. All of the studies that I've seen so far from many different countries indicate that there's an extremely small number of false or manufactured complaints of rape or sexual assault. But I'm pretty sure that this is an experience in many other countries, is there's this often this assumption, oh, that women must be lying, and that there's a huge number of false accusations of rape, and that men suffer from these accusations. Now, I haven't also seen any evidence that men overall suffer, because if we look at sort of global examples, and let's look outside of Africa at the moment, I mean, we look at the American president has been accused of rape. Doesn't seem to have suffered any negative consequences there. We have a number of quite prominent music stars that, you know, in America, who've been not only accused but convicted in some instances of sexual assault, who still have viable music careers. So this is kind of one of those common circulating, it's almost a myth, but it feels like it's a belief. There's a strong belief that, well, a lot of people who complain about rape are faking it in order to somehow punish the man. Can anyone else share any ideas from their own experience, their own country, or their own community of beliefs or misconceptions? Anyone? Anyone willing to sort of jump in? If you do have any things, you can type or you can unmute yourself. I'd love to hear some of your voices too, because I feel like, I don't know if, you know, you're very quiet this morning. Anyone have any suggestions or any comments? Or you know, I mean, I'm pretty confident that Kenya and Uganda are not full of only facts. Anyone? Okay, maybe you could think about some things in your own countries or in your area of work. And maybe you could write that down and we can talk about it a little bit later. At some point, some of you are going to have to talk, please. Otherwise, it's going to be very boring just listening to me the whole morning. And I do want to get some of your own examples, but we'll return to the presentation. Okay, so what we've done, I'm just giving you some sort of foundational principles so far, which is, first of all, that facts matter, but so does context. That facts are something that you can check, and opinions are based on beliefs, and so opinions are something that you can't check. You can disagree with someone's opinion, but you can't check their opinion in the same way. And I'm going to show you how to distinguish in a little bit between checkable and non-checkable sources. So I want us to start thinking about how can we research our own work, and also Christine asked how can we reference different works, and I'm going to address that later. So I do have a note there. So with researching your own work, the first starting point is to look for checkable information, and so we're going to do an exercise in a minute about trying to distinguish between checkable and non-checkable information. So another point that I've kind of already mentioned, which is you should be checking your data or your facts or your information using the same steps each time. It's quite important to be systematic because this means you're less likely to make mistakes or you're less likely to exclude a step when you're under pressure. So, I mean, if you, not that it was under pressure, but I made a mistake when I sent out an email with a time for today's session because I wasn't paying attention, and I should have actually followed my own steps, which is I usually do check these things, but I missed a few steps this time. One of the other tools that's really, really useful, and we're going to discuss this quite a lot today, which is try to prepare a diverse set of information resources in advance. And this will allow you to work more quickly and accurately when it's needed. So the reason why I say this is important is sometimes we really want to check, something, but we've got maybe a day before a story stops being newsworthy, or maybe we get contacted by a local media outlet and they want comment. And we don't know how to check because it's been ages since we've looked at the statistics. We haven't read the recent studies. So as an organization, it's really, really useful. It's almost like having a first aid kit of information. It's really useful to have it ready before you need it. So you don't want a first aid kit after you've already cut your finger and you need a plaster. You want to have the Band-Aids ready and waiting. And so part of this is to try and think for your organization, what are the resources? Who are the experts that might be able to help me? What are the studies that I should understand? What are the agencies that are producing data that would be interesting to me? And make sure you know their websites, you know the contact people, maybe even start building a contact list of the phone numbers, the email addresses of the people who work in those organizations. And I think this also points to another feature of fact-checking is we should never rely on one single source of information, and that includes ourselves. So often when we work in community areas, we work in activism, we are the experts in certain things. The problem is because we know our thematic areas so well, we tend to think that we're infallible or we're the only people who have data. And we need to challenge that. So it's kind of like, I should have checked the time. You should never edit your own work. You should always have somebody else checking for you. So can you bring in other people to help you check your own assumptions? Sometimes maybe you've been working in the field for so long, you haven't bothered to check if the data has changed or if information has changed. It's really important to have external verification of the information that you're including. And I see Christine's posted something on the side. We'll come back to that in a minute. So here, I want to move to checkable and non-checkable. And I'm going to discuss this slide, and then I'm going to come back to what Christine has said in the chat. And if anybody else has anything that they want to post in the chat, you're welcome to type it there. Or if you don't want to type in the chat, you can also stick your hand up and you can unmute your mic. So before we start looking at resources, which we're going to look at a little bit later, I want to explain the idea of checkable versus non-checkable pieces of information. And so I said at the start, I said facts are something that is checkable and opinions are something that are not. But sometimes it's quite hard to tell the difference between what's fact and what's opinion. And rhetoric is a type of opinion. And rhetoric is something that we commonly see used in political communication, in governmental communication, official communication. And it's often very hard to check the rhetoric. So I'm taking some examples. I thought I would move away from Kenya and Uganda, and I'd look at just providing examples from South Africa's government, because maybe that'll be a little bit easier to be critical about. And these are some statements from this year's State of the Nation address that South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa gave in February. And I want you to try and think in each of the statements that I've got there, and I'm going to read them for you. I want you to tell me if you think that they are checkable or not checkable. So I'm going to read them each once, and then I'm going to go back to each of them. I'm going to ask you, and you can type or you can unmute yourselves to say whether you think it's checkable or not checkable. So here's the first statement. We will harness technology to transform the way that government works. We'll invest in digital public infrastructure to give people access to government services anytime. Next, in the blue block, to create this virtuous cycle of investment, growth, and jobs, we must lift economic growth to above 3%. And in the red block, during the past year, young people secured 235,000 work opportunities through the National Pathway Management Network. Okay, so those are just three statements to get us to start thinking about what is checkable and what's not. And I'll talk about why this is important as well in a moment, not just for fact checking, but for your own practice. So let's go back to the first statement. We'll harness technology to transform the way that government works. We'll invest in digital public infrastructure to give people access to government services anytime. Is this checkable or not checkable? Okay, Christine says it's checkable. Anyone else? I've got Christine being very active in the chat there. I think I'm going to need to challenge the rest of the group to interact a bit more. Mercy says checkable. Let's try and get a couple more responses. We will harness technology to transform the way that government works. We'll invest in digital public infrastructure to give people access to government services at any time. Okay, so I've got lots of people on the side saying that it is checkable. I'm interested. Sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. I want to see your chat. So let me just pause for a moment and ask. Let me stop the screen sharing. How would you check that? I'm going to go back to the screen because everyone seemed to indicate that it's checkable, but I want to ask how would you check that? How can you check if a government will harness technology? How can you check if a government will transform? What does it mean? What does transform mean? How do you check transform? How can you check what the government will be doing in the future? When they say we'll invest in digital public infrastructure, what does that mean? I mean, do they tell, it doesn't tell us what the infrastructure is. It just says, what is digital? Does it mean something that switches on and off with electricity? Does it mean something that uses a mobile phone or a computer? Okay, Rahima says you check it looking at the budget. What would you look for in the budget? Christine says ensure that there's a department of IT for citizens to use. So I'm going to challenge all of you and I'm going to say this is not really checkable because what it is it's very generic and there's a lot of rhetoric in there. So what they're doing, and this is a very typical political sentence, it's saying lots of things First of all, it's promising to do things in the future. So unless any of us have, like a time machine, we can't check the future. We can't check it now. We can make a note of it, okay? We can track their promises and see what they're going to do later on. But the reason why I chose this sentence in particular is it's very vague. It doesn't actually tell you anything. So it's like even Rahima says you can check the budget. Oh, what would I check the budget for? Because they haven't given me enough information here. So what would I check? When they say we'll invest in digital public infrastructure, I mean, the government could, does that mean investing in fiber? Does it mean investing in cell phone towers? Does it mean buying equipment? They don't say what any of that is. So they're just broadly saying, we're going to improve the infrastructure. Now, infrastructure could refer to everything. Christina made a point on the side saying that people should have access to the internet. So how would we measure access? So I want you to start thinking about the fine points of this, okay? Rahima says, look at the allocations of funds for the financial year. So Rahima, I spend a lot of time looking at government allocations, and infrastructural allocations can, first of all, be placed maybe over 5, 10, 25 years, depending. But what I'm pointing out to you here is there's nothing specific in that statement that would allow me to check anything particular. So again, well, let me ask the question. Atieno goes, what if the government puts these infrastructures in and people access them? So Atieno, what would infrastructure mean to you? What is infrastructure?
So for example, I would give a random example. When the government put up in the rural areas, I don't know how you call those things, but the things that enable people access free internet.
Right, but that actually has a name, right? So you would call it that. Maybe you'd call it like Wi-Fi points or something, right?
Yeah.
So the point that I make to you, so you're not wrong, but what governments do is they never say anything specific. Okay, so what they should be doing is if they want us to be able to actually, if they want to be held to account, they have to say, we are going to put in 100 new free Wi-Fi points across the city of Nairobi. But they don't always say that. What they often say is, we're going to invest in digital infrastructure. And those two are not the same thing from a fact-checking perspective. And it's important from an organizational perspective because I find a lot of global organizations, including the UN and the World Health Organization, and a lot of local activism, human rights organizations often focus on these sort of generic ideas. We will improve infrastructure. We will transform. We will improve diversity. How do you check what is an improvement? I mean, if I'm going to say as a government, I'm going to improve diversity. I'm going to improve gender diversity in my government. I have a cabinet of, let's say, 100 people, of which 88 are men and 12 are women. I am going to improve it by hiring one more woman. I have technically improved the gender diversity. Have I really made a significant change? So what I'm pointing out to you is that in many politician speeches and in many of our organizational documents, I'm going to try and do this drawing thing again. Let's see if I can draw. Is a lot of us tend to default to this kind of language where we say things. And exactly, Atieno makes point is if it's not smart, it's hardly checkable. So we say things that sound good, right? They sound good. But it's really hard to hold someone to account for that because literally, if our president says we'll invest in digital public infrastructure to give people access to government services, if they put up one Wi-Fi point, they can say, well, we've invested in infrastructure. But it's really hard to pin down. What does he mean? What does he mean by digital public infrastructure? Is he talking about 4G, 5G? Is he talking about Wi-Fi? Is he talking about, like, he's not being specific. So it's very hard to check. And this is something that's going to come up a lot. So if you had to fact check that, it would be very difficult. You could also make a note. You could make a note, as some of you've mentioned, you could make a note that in future to pay attention to the budget and to see how much of the government's current budget has been allocated towards projects that could fall under digital infrastructure or technology. But there again, because the government hasn't given you any specifics, you would be guessing a little bit. So you could investigate a little bit more, but I'm pointing out this is a very common language. And the common language of politics, governance, and even of activism is sometimes quite a lot of rhetoric. Sometimes the rhetoric is very dramatic, but often it's very subtle. So I want to move on to one of the second statements. Okay, so if we can type on the side. To create this virtuous cycle of investment, growth, and jobs, we must lift economic growth to above 3%. Is it checkable or is it not checkable? I'm going to put Jamela on the spot here. Do you think that that's checkable or not checkable, Jamela? To create this virtuous cycle of investment, growth, and jobs, we must lift economic growth to above 3%. Checkable or not checkable? And I know that these feel trickier than they should be, and that's the point. It's like all these things that we take for granted, and we think, oh, it's so obvious and so evident. So once we start looking at what people are actually saying, we realize it's not as simple. Okay? To create this virtuous cycle of investment, growth, and jobs, we must lift economic growth to above 3%. Okay, so everyone's too afraid to answer now. But I'm going to say that in a sense, it's not checkable because it's a future promise. So if the president says we must lift economic growth to above 3%, it's something that must be done in the future. And the other question that I have is, what is economic growth? And I think this is relevant, especially if we look at this idea of a sort of a feminist economics, is particularly in economics, is often terms that are used that are quite generic, that could have many meanings. So when we say economic growth, are we meaning GDP? Are we meaning lifting people out of poverty? So what is meant by economic growth? And again, so if we wanted to say, all right, he's made this thing that we need to increase something by 3%, what would we want to measure if we wanted to see in a year's time how we have fared in terms of economic growth? There's not one single benchmark, okay? So Christine even said the access to services. So these are important. So again, a lot of the time, and we're all guilty of it, but we say things like growth, economic growth, but we don't specify what we mean by that. Do we mean, as Christine notes on the side, access to services or access to finance? Are we talking pure GDP? Are we talking Christina Kinney says ease of doing business. So there are so many things that we could measure. And the point I'm hoping you take out of this is, first of all, that we all talk a lot of hot air. And what I'm going to strongly recommend is when you start developing your story ideas is to try and avoid the hot air, right? I still want you to have opinion and I still want you to have personality and I want you to put yourself and your thinking into things. But try not to rely on statements that ultimately are meaningless. Sometimes we need a little bit of that to make the narrative work. But what we find is that so many politicians, so many businesses, donor funders, they make these grand promises that sound great, but actually, when it comes down to accountability and transparency, are really hard to pin down to anything specific. And so fact-checking also reminds us to pay attention to transparency, credibility, accountability through checking our promises and checking our content. Okay, the final one I hope is a little bit easier. During the past year, young people secured 235,000 work opportunities through the National Pathway Management Network. Is this checkable or not checkable? Hopefully we're back on some more familiar ground here. This is the third statement. Okay, everyone's going checkable, yay! And this is checkable, okay? So this again is, I know And the problem is sometimes checkable statements are a little bit more boring, because if we look at this statement, it's definitely less exciting than a promise of digital transformation and digital access for everybody. But it's much more checkable. So what we have to do, exactly. So Rahima, perfect. You've said it's checkable because it's already passed. They said during the previous year, 235,000 young people, so they've given us a definition, and by young people, the government probably usually means people 18 to 25. So they have a definition of youth that's quite common. Each government will have its own version. Secured 235,000 work opportunities. So now remember, they're not saying jobs, they're calling them work opportunities specifically because they're not actually being employed, but they had access to an opportunity. Okay, so that's in itself a little bit of a political rhetoric. But we know that that's something measurable. They've given us an actual number, and they've told us how this was accessed, which is through the National Pathway Management Network. So now we would be able to go and research the National Pathway Management Network at government. We'd be able to see what does the program mean, and we could check their figures, right? They would probably put out a report or something like that. So this is something that is checkable for a change, because I'm just going to try and see if I can move on. Sorry, I want to try and remove the, great. I just wanted to make sure that the that my pen notes were going to be removed on the next slide. So I'm just using some very, very small examples, and this is important as a prompt, as a reminder to us, okay, of the common language that we use and what are the flaws and the challenges with using this kind of language. So I'll tell you other terms that are really hard to check: democracy, freedom. And again, I mean, I don't want to create any conflict, but we have different restrictions on or different levels of media freedom in each of the countries that we're based in. In some countries and not others, it's much easier to criticize the government. And I mean, criticism of government is important, but I understand it's not always possible. But so when things, for example, in Uganda, the president might issue a statement about how strong media freedom is. Freedom is really hard to assess. What is freedom? In fact, for media freedom, we do actually have benchmarks. So we have some organizations that would rank media freedom based on certain criteria. So you have organizations like Reporters Without Borders that do a press freedom ranking every year, and they have transparent methods. But if we had to say, like, which is the most democratic country in Africa, is there such a thing? How would we measure it? And what is democracy? And even in an economic, from an economic viewpoint, and economics is not my focus area, but we always have this competition as to who is the biggest economy in Africa, or which economy in Africa has grown more. And there's a lot of competition between South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, in terms of economic sort of status. But how you measure the growth of an economy can change depending on which measurements you use. So a lot of terms that we assume are standard or universal might have different meanings in different contexts. And again, politicians and multinational organizations are very familiar with this. And so what they often do in their content is they provide rhetoric rather than checkable information. So this is a pitfall that I'm going to strongly caution everybody to steer away from where possible. Obviously, you still want a narrative that's compelling. If you only produce a report that's full of facts, it's really boring and no one will read it. So the balance is you've got to kind of mix that sort of personal narrative with factual information that can be checked. But also remind yourself that when people say things like, we are going to expand our digital network, it's really hard to know what is meant by that. So if at all possible, provide specifics, because that also makes you more accountable. It's also a really good technique because it helps you to ask better questions. So I'm sure many of you have to engage with local or international government and government organizations. Is if you ask them for generic things, they will give you generic responses. But if you come to them with specific questions, how many new students will receive tablets? How many new students will have access to free Wi-Fi. You would want to ask them something specific. You wouldn't want to say how many students will have improved digital infrastructure. So again, it's a reminder that the way we create our messaging can actually have kind of important outcomes for us. So I'm going to ask you next to start thinking of, if we think back to the exercise I discussed in the previous workshop, but if you did the exercise, you can use what you already wrote down. If you didn't do the exercise, could you take a minute now to, and I will give everyone a minute. I'm actually going to time it so that you actually spend the time. Think about your organization, all right, or your community. Could you write down some of your key messages or focus area points? You don't have to share this. Can you just write them down either on a piece of paper, on your computer, on a screen? Write down some of those key messages or the focus area points for your organization. And then I want to discuss with you if you think that they're checkable or not checkable. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. So I want you to write down, maybe even just 2. Can you write down at least 2 key focus areas or objectives for your organization? And then let's discuss whether there are some things that are checkable or not checkable. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm hoping you're finishing up looking at your own organization. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to post in the chat on the side. I've just taken from the university that I teach at. So here it says, the Wits Centre for Journalism, formerly Wits Journalism, is one of the leading journalism and media training institutions in Africa, with a history spanning more than 2 decades. Situated within the School of Literature, Language and Media at Wits University in Johannesburg, the WCJ has become a leading provider of quality postgraduate teaching, thought leadership, and practical engagement within the changing world of journalism, research, and training. So that's kind of on the about section of the website of our organization. And what it says here is, so it has a name. So names are checkable, by the way. Names are important to check. It says it's one of the leading journalism and media training institutions in Africa. Now, there are rankings of academic institutions, but there's very few rankings that specifically look at journalism and media. So I would say that's an opinion. I mean, I obviously think it's one of the leading ones. I like being there, but I think it's an opinion. Okay, we don't really have an official benchmark. It says it has a history spanning more than 2 decades. That's checkable because we know that it is older than 20 years. It says it's situated within the School of Literature, Language and Media. We can check that. And then at the end, it says it's become a leading provider of quality postgraduate teaching. We don't really have many ways to check that. So again, we could look at university rankings or program rankings. It also says it's a leading provider of thought leadership. And thought leadership is kind of a concept that maybe we understand, but it's very hard to check. And practical engagement, it doesn't tell you what the practical engagement is within the changing world of journalism, research, and training. So there's some checkable stuff there, there's some opinion-based stuff there, there's some rhetoric. And this is pretty standard for any organization. So can anybody tell me, if you went and you looked at your own organization's values or strategic objectives, who found something that and I'm not saying it's a problem, by the way, it's normal to also have opinion-based things. It's normal to say we are wonderful. You know, you're supposed to do that. That would be abnormal if you didn't. But has anybody managed to, okay, who managed to find something that wasn't checkable? Does anyone want to share? What did you manage to find? A statement about your organization, your business, your community. Anybody find anything that was checkable? Or something that you're not sure whether it's checkable or not?
For me, the core values are checkable because I have teamwork, transparency, and equality.
Okay, so how would you check teamwork?
The way we handle the work, is it personal? But ours, everyone has to serve. Everyone puts in their input.
Okay, I mean, but that's kind of a practice, so it would be hard to, I mean, okay, you know, possibly you could demonstrate it. You could demonstrate teamwork. How would you demonstrate equality?
Through the pay and also the number of people that are there and serving on different jobs.
Okay, does everyone have the same idea of equality? So I think the challenge there is many of us have organizational values like leadership, teamwork, equality, representation, diversity. These are often, they're good values. Okay, so I'm not saying there's anything wrong with them, but they're not necessarily checkable values. If we say something like, we aim to transform the lives of women and children in our area, is it checkable? If we say equality, equality might mean different things to different people. So what you could say is, well, you know, what we have is we have diversity, we have people from different backgrounds. That might not mean equality to everyone assessing it. So these are, in a sense, less checkable. They're more opinion-based. Again, this doesn't make them bad. I'm just saying, let's be aware of when we're creating stories, we often like to share values, and values are very hard to check. Values are essentially almost founded in belief systems. So Christine Akini notes gender balance. So again, what I mean, is gender balance 50-50? Are we talking about 50% men, 50% women? Do we mean 70% women, 30% men? What is balance? And again, I am trying to provoke a little bit of a different thinking around the words that we use all the time to describe the work that we do. Because we take a lot for granted, and this is again why fact-checking and research processes are important, is to help us to think differently around the sort of the value statements that we have. And so something to think about is that value statements are very often not checkable.
In the focus area, we have also engaging the vulnerable, that is the orphans, and also we engage the women. I think that's checkable because we can look at the activities that we're doing.
Absolutely. So if you said, so I think what's important, and you've raised something important there, which is vulnerable, but you've specified orphans. So engaging with orphans is checkable. Engaging with vulnerable is a little bit more of a gray area in terms of being checkable, because who is vulnerable might depend on who's looking and who's asking. And so again, we tend to use, I think I mentioned this last time, but I didn't really get into it, is gender-based violence is a very non-checkable term. And for me, it's one of the problems when we as organizations, but when politicians use gender-based violence. So most countries that I've worked with do not have a specific legal definition of gender-based violence, because when we say gender-based violence, do we mean violence against women? Or we mean violence that is because of somebody's gender? But then in which case, do we not say that masculine violence is also because of their gender? So men who get involved in a fight at a tavern or who have a brawl and who murder each other on the side of the road, they are interacting with each other in toxic masculine ways. It's kind of systemic masculine violence. So that's also that's violence related to their gender. But we don't mean that kind of violence when we talk about gender-based violence. So gender-based violence is very non-checkable. It's not a legal term. Again, I mean, if we think about in different countries, which crimes fall under gender-based violence? Rape would normally fall under gender-based violence. Does child abuse fall under gender-based violence? Does kidnapping fall under gender-based violence? Does rape fall under gender-based violence if a woman is raped? But what about if a man is raped by another man? Again, so it's not always clear. So Christine says femicide falls under gender-based violence. Femicide, again, is also in most countries, except for a couple of countries in Latin America, it's not always a legal term. So different countries have different definitions of femicide. And femicide is a lot more specific than gender-based violence. So I use the term femicide a lot, but I try and avoid gender-based violence. I think that if we want to be specific, gender-based violence is a great term for political speeches, but at a practical level, it has very little meaning. Unless you define it, maybe you have, we deal with gender-based violence, by which we mean these types of violence. So exactly what Nechama was saying is we deal with vulnerable people, by whom I mean orphans. So I think it's really important to specify what you mean when you talk about generalized terms, is to actually provide specifics. And remember that your definition might be different to other people. So I know that in South Africa, we have at least 2 or 3 working definitions of femicide. There is a theoretical definition, which is a woman killed by a man because she's a woman. Very, very hard to demonstrate in a police investigation or in a court case. We don't know who the perpetrators are. We don't know what their motives are in many instances. The medical researchers use a definition of woman aged 14 years and older. The police services use a definition of women aged 18 years and older who are killed by anyone for any reason. So not only women who are killed by men. There are other definitions of femicide in different countries that include all female murders from babies right through to old women, but that's not the case in South Africa generally. So even femicide could have a lot of different meanings. And when we start thinking about using fact-checking processes, in fact, and I should have put this on as a slide, and maybe I'm actually going to update the PowerPoint before I send it all to you, is adding a definition of what you mean when you use a word is really important. So if we move away from this sort of checkable, non-checkable fact opinion, is values generally are not checkable. But then many of the words that we think have a specific meaning need definition in order to be checkable. So again, if we spoke about gender-based violence, what would that mean to each of you? What does gender-based violence mean? How do you check gender-based violence if you don't provide a clear definition? Can anyone think of any other examples that they experience in their work? Something that is also kind of hard for them to define, or maybe would be useful to define? Okay, if you think of any ideas, you can write them up on the side. And we're going to start just moving into, because we actually are, others are going to run out of time. I'm going to start to, so definitions are important, all right? So I asked you to write down some of your key messages or focus points and think about whether they're checkable or non-checkable. And so the point, again, I'm trying to provoke you. I'm trying to make you feel a little bit uncomfortable about assumptions. And I'm telling you that if you can sit in that place of being uncomfortable for a little bit, it will improve your work. And I know this from experience because I have made myself uncomfortable by proving myself wrong. I think it's really, really valuable to question our assumptions that we think we know what a certain thing means. And then we don't. Okay, Sharon put a great, intergenerational equity. That's a wonderful phrase. It sounds amazing. I mean, I want intergenerational equity, but what does it mean? Okay. Feminism. Thank you. Yes. What? Okay, feminism. Wow. I mean, we know that can be a bona fide. Are we talking about intersectional feminism? What about white feminism, black feminism? Which year of feminism are you talking about? So feminism can have so many different meanings. And, many of us will think, well, feminism is about female empowerment. But you also have to provide detail there. So feminism, not checkable. It's a value, it's a concept, it's a philosophy, it's a theory. It can mean many different things to many people. I love these two examples. They're fantastic. So these are words that we use a lot. Like if we say we have feminist principles, and I do see a lot of organizations have feminist principles, feminist data principles. What does that mean? I think the point here is not to say that you shouldn't use words like that, but rather to remind us that words like that are often value-based or rhetoric-based, and they don't actually have a specific universal meaning. And so if we're going to use words like that, we should also provide a definition of what those words mean to us. What does vulnerable mean? What does gender mean? I mean, we've just seen this terrible court case in the UK that's declared that, the definition of a woman is a biological woman. And that has so many implications that will be quite harmful for a number of people. So important to consider definitions, or, definitions matter. So I want to move into some more practical things so we don't run out of time. We can talk about these. I want to talk to you about some useful sources. So if we start to think about the importance in our own messaging and in our own language, in our own content for general workplace content, but also for the story ideas that you're going to develop, I want you to think about checkable information. I really strongly believe it's important to root your opinion pieces or to root your editorial content in something that's checkable, because it makes it more accountable and it makes you more credible. If you're trying to share information, it makes you credible. It also, when we use facts to show something, and particularly I mentioned this gender data gap at the beginning, one of the most important things for me about building data about violence against women in different contexts is it proves absolutely that the violence that women experience is very, very similar across generations, across communities, and it's very prevalent. So if you don't have something that's checkable, if you can't prove that it exists in the data, it's very, very easy to say, oh, that's just one woman's experience. That's the exception. It's not the norm. Data allows us to prove something is the norm. So even if you want to focus on an individual story, you want to focus on one vulnerable person, one woman, one family, if you can somehow in your story link that back to data that shows that this person, this family, this matter is not the exception, it strengthens your argument. Okay, so we're looking at not being boring with facts and not just listing facts, but we're looking at using checkable information to strengthen the argument that we're making. And that can be sometimes my opinion or my belief based on this factual information is XYZ. So we're using facts and data to strengthen our information, not to replace people and narrative and values. Values are also really important. So I'm going to just start by mentioning here some useful sources that we can look at. And I'm going to show you how to use and find them specifically for your countries or your areas of interest. So where can we find checkable information? Where can we find data that backs up or supports the kinds of things that we're looking for? So starting points here, we're looking for government departments, international organizations. They come with problems. I'm going to discuss those in a moment. Academic studies, universities. Sorry, my page is now blocking what I'm seeing. Statutory bodies, statistical agencies. We also want to include independent experts, accredited professionals, things like law reports, and even newspaper archives can be useful sources of checkable information, right? Because it's stuff that's already happened, it's been published, it's been distributed, and we can use these as sources. These are not the only sources, but these are good sources to start off with. And I just did note here that choosing any source is always a subjective process. So I'm aware of that. I know that choosing a statistical report versus interviews with people is a choice, and it can reflect that in the story. I want to ask a question though. A lot of the times when people write stories, we rely on data from the development sector, so the aid sector, or from NGOs and CBOs. So I want to ask you, what are the limitations or the problems with relying on data from the development sector? And what are the limitations on relying on data from the state? So before I start looking at how to access data, can anyone think of, let's focus on the development sector because many of you are connected to that. What are the problems with relying on data that is provided to us by the development sector? Can anyone think of any challenges? I think we're at a high point when we're going on intergenerational equity and feminism. Anyone? What are the challenges if we get data from DFID or from USAID before it shut down? We get data around the Sustainable Development Goals. Can anyone think of, I mean, is that data great? Should we just take it without question? Are there ever any problems with that kind of data that gets provided to us? Okay, so maybe you're all too shy to be critical of sort of the places that you often work in. I think I made myself unpopular for years by criticizing these things. I've got a hand up. Mercy, do you want to talk?
Yes, what I wanted to say is that relying mostly on data from the development agencies is that some of the data is usually skewed towards the agendas that they are driving, and sometimes they are not representative of whatever you're researching. So it will be more towards what they're working or the projects they're driving rather than the reality of how things are on the ground.
Absolutely. You've said it perfectly. Thank you so much. It's exactly that. I really want us to remember that as much as these organizations can be useful, is that particularly development agencies, now historically, their agenda is to continue to drive aid. And although a lot of them make claims about sustainability and, moving beyond that, is when you conceive of Africa as a begging bowl, that is the data that you gather. So we have a lot more data on poverty than we have on, women entrepreneurship. And we need to have balance there. Also, and this is my personal experience, I'm not saying this is true of all organizations, I have found many instances where donor agencies have wanted data about one particular thing, even though I've wanted data about something else. So I've been funded for projects where I had gone and applied for funding to research something that I thought was important for local information. But the donor said that they wanted information about something else. And so that was what got the funding. When we have large catch-alls like previously the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of our funding, reporting, and research tends to speak to those goals. I'm not so sure that the SDGs are that meaningful for me. The SDGs are, they're more value-based than checkable in a lot of instances. And the problem is that because the United Nations has put those indicators in place, and said that these are the core indicators. If we disagree with them, if we say, well, we have some other indicators that we'd like to look at, it's often very hard to get information about indicators that fall outside of the SDGs. I'm sure many of you will have experience of writing reports or putting in funding proposals where you are required to say which of the SDGs your proposal will address. But who says that the SDGs are the thing that we need to focus on? So a lot of our information, a lot of the research, a lot of the data that we get from development organizations and agencies is very much focused, as Mercy very correctly said, on the agenda of those organizations. Their agendas tend to be very, in my experience, Western dominated by what they think is best for the African continent or the global South in particular. And they tend not to encourage data development outside of those narrow goals. So we need to be aware that as helpful as it is and as important a role as it plays, there are limitations and there are problems. Equally, I asked another question on that page is, what are the limitations of data that we get from the state? So I don't want to put anybody in a challenging situation, but what are the challenges with government information? Anyone? Does anyone here find it easy to get information from your government? Do you trust the information from your government, from official sources? So we've got Mercy, they're saying political influence and manipulation. We also often find that governments generally don't like making themselves look bad. Christina mentions recycled information and outdated. This is so important. We're going to see this in a minute now when we start looking at examples. Is government information is not always current. It doesn't cover or research things that it doesn't want to talk about. So if you find a government report doesn't mention certain things, or they might obscure certain information by making the financial information impenetrable. I know when I look at justice reporting from South Africa and from other countries, the annual reports for the departments are often so confusing, and I work with them all the time. But they change the information categories every year. One year they'll report. Let's say, look at health reporting. One year they'll report on children who were immunized between the ages of 0 and 3. The next year they'll report on 0 to 5. So you can't compare them year on year. Jamela mentions distrust. In fact, Jamela and a few others mentioned that mistrust of government. So many of us don't trust our governments. Would we trust that data? Maureen says information is diversionary. Governments always want to highlight the successes, what they've done well. They never tell you about the bad stuff. So they'll send out a report saying, South African example. Again, I'm trying not to make you too critical. I mean, I want you to be critical of your own governments, but I'm not going to criticize your governments. I'll criticize my own. In South Africa, they'll say, we have a prosecution success rate for rape cases of 87%. I'm making that figure up. That's not true. But what they don't tell you is that 87% is of cases that have gone through one center. And those only represent about 10 to 15% of all rape cases that get opened. So that means that about 80% or more of rape cases that get opened at a police station never make it to the court. Once they're in court, if they are helped through, there's a process here we have called Thuthuzela care centers, which are supposed to help particularly victims of sexual violence. If a case reaches the Thuthuzela care center, then it has, it gets to the prosecutor, it has a higher chance of conviction, which is true. But that represents, 10 to 15% of all cases. So their success rate is actually not what they say it is. They've cherry-picked the numbers. I'm going to talk about how to misrepresent numbers in a moment as well. Maureen also comments, a lot of the time they use statistics and numbers to hide important information. They rely on our unwillingness or our inability to check their data or to question them. And they often put their data and their numbers, they often don't say numbers. They just use those values and those kind of rhetorical, uncheckable statements, we will make sure that, or women will be safe, women will be free. So that they tell you things that aren't checkable. And so again, I'm using these as cautionary examples because we should avoid following suit. So important to just consider the limitations of the data that we often rely on from our states, or from development organizations. So both have limitations and restrictions. the other point that somebody's already touched on now are the kinds of biases. So, I mean, whether or not we trust information is important. I just want to reduce this so I can read all my lists. Data usually has an agenda because it's created by a human or prompted by a human. And so we need to be aware of different types of bias that could exist, not only in the data that exists, but also when we go looking for information or we're looking to check ourselves. There are so many different types of biases. So confirmation bias is I go looking for bias that agrees with what I already think. Sorry, I go looking for data that agrees with what I already think. If I think that women make false allegations of rape, I use that as a prompt. So a study on false allegations of rape. So I go specifically looking for data that agrees with what I'm already believing. I don't look for data that challenges my belief or my biases. Sampling bias is I choose a small sample. So it's only going to give me a small outcome. Or I choose people who are already part of a... So let's say I wanted to do a poll on abortion or a termination of pregnancy, a woman's access to termination of pregnancy. If I only poll a small area that I know is, let's say, very conservative and very religious, then the poll will say, 97% of respondents say that women, should not be able to access determination under any circumstances. If I broadened my sample and I included other areas that were less conservative, that might change my results. Similar to that is something called cherry picking, and that's a selection or exclusion bias. That means where I come up with lots of different results, but some of the studies have information that I don't really like because some of the studies don't agree with what I believe. So I'm going to only choose the studies that agree with what I believe. Vaccines during COVID were very, very contentious. So people would reject studies that showed vaccines were safe, but they would find a couple of the preprints that said, oh, well, that there were these terrible side effects for the vaccines. Then you've got something called the bullseye effect, which I've always loved in particular, which is where you fit your argument to suit the data, where you actually kind of, it's almost, and this is named for, imagine if you hold up a blank target and you shoot an arrow, you shoot a bullet through the target and it makes a hole. And then you draw the bullseye around the hole. So it shows that you were accurate, but you haven't actually made an argument supported by data. You've just chosen data and made that the center of the argument. You also have AI and computational bias. This is increasingly important, where even using a search engine sometimes, but AI programs don't always have good information, particularly about Africa. We don't always know what the biases are in there in terms of their training data or whatever they have access to. We know that generative AI programs like ChatGPT make up information sometimes. So we need to be aware that there is bias that exists in computational requests or programs. Even in terms of the ranking of things. So if we search for something on Google or we search for something on social media might tell us that this result is really important because it comes from a prominent news agency, but actually a better result might be something from a smaller organization or a scientific journal. Convenience bias is, well, I'm just going to choose the easiest sample that's available to me. I'm quite lazy. If you're using Google now, or most of the search engines, you'll get an AI summary of your question when you type it in. So you don't need to raise your hands, but how many of you have already relied on that AI summary to answer your question? Please don't, by the way, it often makes errors. So convenience bias is, I'm searching for a recipe. I click the first recipe result that I get rather than looking for the best result. Other biases actually rely on our own inherent belief systems. So political beliefs can introduce bias. It can mean that you are more likely to believe a statement made by a politician or a political party that you support, and less likely to believe a statement made by a party that you oppose. So we see there's quite a lot of research on American politics, much less on African politics, unfortunately. But in American politics, for example, Republicans believe that they are constantly being censored on social media. Republicans and right-wing people believe that they're constantly being censored. But all of the data and the research shows that this doesn't take place, and that in fact social media tends to be far more accommodating of the center and the right than it does of left-wing views. But there is a perception amongst certain political beliefs that they are being discriminated against. And for kind of similar belief reasons is when they hear a statement made by a Republican, by one of Donald Trump's politicians, they will believe them without checking. Whereas if a claim is made by a Democrat or somebody who is opposed to Trump, they will reject that information without checking, again, simply because of their political beliefs. And religious and cultural beliefs have a similar impact on our biases. If we hold deep religious beliefs that say, for example, that eating certain food is wrong, behaving in a certain way is wrong, sex before marriage is wrong, termination of pregnancy is wrong, maybe religious beliefs that hold that the marriage is sacred and central to human society, in which case maybe you would be opposed to divorce or to people being single parents. Maybe you would have personal views that don't believe in supporting homosexuality or queer rights. Maybe all of those sorts of things can influence how you check or don't check data and facts related to those issues. And again, the reason why I'm mentioning this is none of us are going to become perfectly objective in a day or probably ever. But we should all be aware of our own limitations. So just as much as development agencies and governments have agendas and they have limitations, as individuals, we have agendas and we have limitations. And that's why, Nechama, when you mentioned teamwork earlier, teamwork and diversity is a great way to balance out some of these biases, because hopefully our biases are not replicated exactly in the next person. So we can challenge each other on some of our assumptions. Other biases that we have, and we'll talk about this in a moment, number biases. Sometimes when we see something represented as a graph or as a chart, we tend to trust it without questioning, because we're often told that numbers don't lie. So I want to tell you, numbers absolutely do lie. They're often misrepresented. They're graphed incorrectly. The numbers themselves are cherry-picked. They're not representative. They're taken out of context. So number bias is when we're either overwhelmed by numbers, so we don't check it because we think we can't understand it, or we assume that the numbers are correct because numbers can't lie. So numbers do lie because humans actually can prompt those numbers. Some of the tools that you can use when, I'm just actually, if I want to skip ahead, I want to just skip ahead to this working with numbers for a minute relating to that, is, I don't know how many of you like working with numbers. I know that this is a feminist economics summer school, but I don't know if numbers are your thing or if they're not, and it's okay if they're not your thing. So one of my points I make here is if numbers aren't your thing, find a colleague or a consultant who does like working with figures and percentages. But don't try and imagine or work with numbers if you're not confident, particularly if you're working with percentages, proportions, and rates, which are kind of the most common ways that many of us would use numbers in public-facing communication. So I'm not talking about budget reporting, but when we're explaining our work to other people. If you are using numbers, figures, data, or graphs to tell a story, always include your sources and make sure that your information is accurate and correct. There is a difference, by the way, between accuracy and correctness. We can talk about that in a minute. Very important, don't create numerical data where the truth is that you don't know or you don't have data about a phenomenon. So rather just say, we don't know, or there's not enough data. Don't create a story to fill the gap. And also don't round numbers up or down in ways that change the outcome or the impact of the statement. And you might think, oh, well, who would do that? But actually, it's quite a common feature, particularly in the NGO space and in the activism space, where people take numbers and they maybe inflate them or they round them up because it sounds more impactful, because you feel very passionately or very strongly about your cause and you want the numbers to back up your passion. So sometimes it's not even about numbers. For example, in South Africa around rape, we've had many claims made over the years that, for example, a woman is more likely to be raped than to learn how to read, or that a woman is raped in South Africa every X many seconds or X many minutes. And the problem with that is that we actually don't have very good data on rape. We know the number of rape cases that are lodged at a police station every year. We don't know how many cases are never taken to a police station. So people will say things like, 1 in 5 rapes are not reported, but we don't know. So when it comes to unreported cases, we don't know, because we don't know what we don't know. And so sometimes we want to try and fill in that gap, and we want to make this really terrible claim. We want to say South Africa is the rape capital of the world, because we want people to pay attention to what is a very serious problem and has been for a long time. But we also don't consider how helpful is it to say that South Africa is the rape capital of the world. How would we judge that? Are we talking about the number of rapes per population? Are we talking about the total number of rapes? We don't actually know what the total number of rapes is, because most of them are unreported. So it creates this problem again where we make a statement based on numbers that don't exist. And this happens very commonly in the NGO and the activist space. So I can just see there's some notes on the chat. Rahima makes, so yeah, one day our Minister of Finance tells that our financial status is up, and yet it's on the grounds going up. Christina asked, what about legal provisions? Christina, I'm not sure which legal provisions you mean, but we'll come back to that in a second. So I'm nearly done with my slides, and I haven't even had a chance to show you how this works. So if with your permission, because we started a little bit late, if I could ask everyone, maybe just if you can join us for an extra 10 minutes. Past the end of the hour. I just want to show you how to apply some of this. So I wanted to talk to you about tools or concepts that you can use when you're assessing your data. And maybe, Christine, this will address some of what you're talking about. I want you to think about sources. So what is the source I'm using for my information? I want you to think about methods. What are the methods that have been used to build this information? I want you to think about matching data. So one source says there are 10 people. Another source says there are 25. Which one is it? Do the data match? Do they agree with each other? Are they different? I want you to think about bias. I want to think about the possibility of corrections. First of all, has the data that you're using for your organization been corrected or updated? Scientific studies so let's think about on healthcare. Many years ago, there was with moms who were pregnant with HIV and who were taking antiretrovirals to prevent transmission to their children. The initial thinking from healthcare professions was that HIV positive moms should never breastfeed their children. But later on, as ARV protocols improved, the thinking changed that HIV positive, even these moms should absolutely 100% breastfeed their children, provided they exclusively breastfed. So if they were bottle feeding at all or anything else, or as soon as they started introducing solids, then the breastfeeding had to stop. So protocols change, information changes and updates. So it's important to think about, has your information that you rely on, has that been updated or corrected? And a second thing is, if there are claims made by your organization that are wrong, maybe you used the wrong data. Maybe, like me, you sent out the wrong time. So it could even be something simple. How do you admit error? And this is also something that we never really think about, is we want to be right and we hate being wrong. So when we're wrong, we want to hide it under the carpet. But actually, the best thing to do when you're wrong, if you want people to trust you, is to say, I was wrong. Here's the correction. This is why it happened. You should always think about the context in which data is used. You should always think about the age of the data or information that you are using. I'm going to show you examples of all of these now. And a final really useful word here is plausibility. So again, I'm going to use a South African example here. Recently, there was a women's organization that shared a very large petition online where they made a claim that in the previous police reporting year, more than 5,000 women had been murdered. Which, if it had been true, would have been the single largest number of women ever murdered in South Africa in the time since we've been recording that data. And it would have represented a nearly 50% increase on previous years. The problem was the information, the number they were using, came from one police report. However, that data did not match any of the figures in any of the other subsequent police reports or previous police reports. But as an activist organization, they were so keen to latch on to this very, unfortunately, horrifically inflated figure that they didn't bother to check it. And ultimately, that will reduce credibility. So I'm also saying plausibility is, if something seems too good to be true or too big to be true, It possibly is. So just take a moment to check it. I've done the number thing. Okay, now I want to go to working with examples for a second. Sorry, and I can see, Christine, did you want to say something? I don't know if it was you who unmuted yourself, but it might have been. Christine, if you want to say something, you can type it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. I've actually prepared, I wanted to talk about some real examples and also to ask you if you have any questions about where could you find information that you're looking for. Ask me now. So Christine, maybe if you want to explain your question about legal provisions, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I wanted to show something. I'm just going to get the screen up here now. I wanted to show you an example, and I hope you can all see your screens properly, is when we look for information. So I started looking for statistical information or data about women in both Kenya and Uganda. And when you go onto Google, one of the first search responses that comes up is UN Women, and this lovely idea of a data dashboard, right? Where they want to count women, because as we said, there's a gender data gap. So if we look here, we have a dashboard. It says, you know, the population of Kenya, your female population. You can download the data. It shows me which region. So it kind of looks very fancy. I'm not sure. So it talks about gender inequality index rank. Again, how do we measure inequality? How do we measure gaps? But then it goes into these categories at the bottom, right, which is a lifetime physical and or sexual intimate partner violence, and then risk of violence in the last 12 months. So I think this is an area that resonates with a lot of work that many of you are doing. So what this has a very interesting little feature here, which is this little eye. So if we look at the lifetime risk of non-partner sexual violence and we click I, it says here data not available. And if we click on the other categories, it says, it tells me what is the source of this data. So it says so according to this, 25%, 26% of Kenyan women have experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence in the last 12 months. And it tells me the source of this data is the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics and the ICF 2014. So it's from a Kenya and Demographic Health Survey from 2014, which based on my experience is probably much older. So that data is already more than 10 years old. That shows me that the age of this data isn't really that great. If we quickly switch to Uganda and the same dashboard, and these are probably some of the most common sources of data that people turn to. They've got the same categories. Here they do have a study on non-partner sexual violence. Again, the source is the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. The source is from a study from 2021, and it's the Uganda Violence Against Women and Girls survey that was published that was from 2020 data. So this data is much more recent. But what's quite funny, and you don't have to answer this now, but I would imagine that a lot more people in each of our countries would be more confident if we said that this data came from UN Women than if we said that this data came from our own country's statistical agencies, which is really funny. So when the UN repackages our data, it's always more palatable. And this is a common feature, again, about distrust of African data. But also what's really important is that we should always go and check the age, right? So this data is quite recent from Uganda, but the data from Kenya, as I mentioned before, is much less recent. And that prompts some questions. I did go and look here. Here's when you look up the Uganda Bureau of Statistics. Here's when you look up the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. So if you remember, there was a slide that I had earlier that said, start to familiarize yourself with the resources that are available to you. So if you don't spend a lot of time on your local statistical agency, it's a good thing to go and do this. So let's go and have a look. How easy is it to find information about statistics in Kenya? So I can go and I can look here at their reports. These are their statistical releases, recent releases. They're also using the Sustainable Development Goals, COVID surveys, food and nutrition, Kenya facts and figures, census reports going back to 2019. So we could, again, just make yourself familiar with people here. And let's try and see what happens when I search for women. So here we have women and men in Kenya, facts and figures from 2022. So that's kind of a lot more recent than the UN data has. So this is already a good sign. I don't know how good the information is. I haven't checked through each of the reports. All I'm trying to show you is that if you go to your own statistical agencies, you might be able to find data that's a little bit more recent than the UN. So don't just rely on the UN or the World Bank as your first point of call. Always check what their sources are and check the age of their sources. So here again, this is quite important. It describes what is the method of the study, how it's done it, what is the percentage rate of respondents. So these are all really quite useful things. Other tools that I wanted to show you how to use, and in fact, I don't know if you can see the search engine here. So when I look up, this is when, again, how the words that we choose matters. So here I just used Google and I typed in data, Uganda, and woman. And if you can see the top data sources it gives me, so this is a computational bias, is the World Bank, the UN Women, World Bank, Afrobarometer, which I wouldn't really use. Again, UN Women. Gosh, it doesn't give me the Uganda Bureau of Statistics at all. Anyway, I'm just saying is when you are looking for information, the terms that you use can also influence the results that you get. And Google is going to rank things like we kind of do in the world, where it's going to put UN results much higher than local stuff. So what I can do there is I can maybe say data, Uganda, woman, and I can add a term Google Scholar. And if I add the term Google Scholar, so you see here's that AI overview at the top. Please skip that. Okay, it's not good. Again, now I'm still getting UN woman at the top. But now I'm getting a few more results. So I'm getting published journal articles. These are usually peer-reviewed journal articles. So you're looking for something that's credible. So Science Direct, Sage journals. And these are, I'm hoping, studies by local scholars. So here is a study by, and I can find out who these are by clicking through. This is a journal article, Ugandan Adolescents, Gender Stereotypes about Domestic Activities and Attitudes about Women. So I can see here this study was done in Eastern Uganda. It had 201 adolescents aged between 11 and 17 years. 48% of them were girls. And I can see who is the lead person on the study. If I click on their name, it shows me that the lead author is Flora Farago, who's at a university in the USA. But based on their name, perhaps they are actually a Ugandan scholar. I could research them. So again, these are checkable pieces of information where I could look and find different types of data. So I really strongly recommend, by the way, if you want to look for scholarly information, is to add on Google Scholar. Okay, I can also add on statistics. And what I could also do if I wanted to was, let's just look for Uganda, hold on, Uganda government. So if we know that the Ugandan government websites have .go.ug, I can actually add this. I can look for government sources that have that in their URL. Okay, so now I've got the Uganda Women's Network. So all I'm doing is I'm changing my search terms here to look for specific things. This may or may not be helpful, but it's all about refining that. Some other tools that I think might be interesting. This is pretty much based, this is only Kenyan at the moment, as far as I'm aware, but this is a really nice project called the Africa Data Hub. Actually, let me just go back and see if it has other countries. I'm familiar with it because of there's Kenyan people involved. So this is about femicide, and they've, I think, done, I'm not a big fan of dashboards. They don't really always work very well. But this project, I think, has been done well, and it's been thought through very well. So if I go through to the Africa Data Hub again, this is about a program specifically to support journalists to tell stories using data. So they have a climate observer. Let's see if I'm wondering if it'll shift to the next one. So they have different dashboards. Right, shows you the dashboards they have here. They have PHC data. Okay, so they've got for Nigeria as well. Femicide in Kenya, climate observer. So this is if you're looking for data about climate change, and they have an inflation observer, which I think might be quite interesting. I haven't seen all of their tools. I've focused mostly on the femicide one. So let's look at the inflation observer. So we're checking this live and in real time. So we don't know. I can't tell you whether the output's going to be useful or not. Let's try and see if it works for Uganda. Okay, so here they've got a visualization of consumer price inflation. So they're telling me specifically what it's visualizing. They're telling me which year it is, and they're giving me a rate. So this is quite useful. They're not just saying inflation, right? So CPI is different to just general inflation. So again, they are being specific. And here they're giving me a nice graph. Is this useful to you? Maybe it is. So this is a tool created to help journalists, but could it help you? So there are several other tools like this. I feel like I've kind of run out of time to talk about all of them. Other things that this was when I went through to the hold on. Okay, no, this wasn't the UN one. If we go back, sorry, last thing, and then I'm going to click off, is if we look here, okay, Uganda Violence Against Women and Girls Survey 2020. All right, this is the source that the United Nations uses, is that I can actually go and look at this up. So I don't have to rely on the United Nations definition. I can actually go and find the original study here. And that can be quite helpful because there might be a lot more information in this study than in the UN summary, for example. So always when you're looking at sources is to try and find the original source if you can, not to use someone else's summarized version, but that's not always possible. Okay, I'm going to stop because we have run over time, and I'm sorry. I know some of you said you have to leave. I do apologize. I'm sorry. We started a bit late, trying to wait for everyone. I really appreciate you sticking it through. Christine, Akinya, I don't know if you want to ask your question about legal provisions. Anybody else, if you want to jump off, I do understand. We've really gone 10 minutes over the expected time. So these are, I will send you the PowerPoint. I'll send you a recording of the session. These are ideas to start to put in place and to think about these ideas and approaches in relation to the story ideas and the themes that we started discussing in our first workshop. There are tools that you can use in any situation, whether you're producing content for the media or you're producing content for a funding report or for your annual report or for yourself. So I think that they are useful practices. And I encourage everyone to really start thinking differently about the words that they use and the facts that they include, and ask for more facts and for more data. So I'm happy to stay for another 5 minutes if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, you're also welcome to leave, and I will see you in a week and a half. I think there's no workshop next week, but we're having a really nice session the following week where we can continue to discuss this a little bit if we want to follow up and have any questions. Gosh, 2 hours really has raced by. But also we're going to do some networking. We're going to introduce you to some really interesting, to me, resources and communities of women producing fantastic research around important issues in Africa. So if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to stay and ask them. Otherwise, I appreciate your time and I will see you soon. I'm going to stop the recording now. If I can work out how to stop the recording. All right, it doesn't, there it is.